Habakkuk is a message for the nation. This is our 4th week, and it's our last week. We began the study with Habakkuk's concern for his nation. We're going to kind of review so that we remember Habakkuk, say in a month. And that's the hope. Because being concerned for the nation, it's also tells us to be concerned for our nation. Are you concerned for our nation and its struggles? Then you can understand this man if you are, because he was very concerned about his nation. Let's remember how things looked. We're going back to the very first chapter, and it read like this. Isaiah had turned away from God. They began following the gods of the pagan nations around them. Politics, rather than God, became important. The society was unstable. Violence, abuse of the law, oppression of the righteous was rampant. People were straying away from God's standard. They were going it alone, and Hezekiah was praying like this. Are you going to do anything about this, God? There's violence and destruction and strife and contention in our nation. Righteousness is not valued. People are perverted in their judgment of things. And as he prayed that prayer, God was silent, or so it seemed. So Habakkuk went to his watchtower. He went to his prayer corner that he had, his personal place. He wanted to seek an answer from God. And so he says this, how long, Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Violence is everywhere, but you do not come to save. Why must I watch all this misery? Wherever I look, I see destruction and violence. I am surrounded by people who love to argue and fight. The law has become paralyzed, and there is no justice in the courts. His approach in prayer was very specific. And you can kind of hear the anxiety in his words. He just poured it out to the Lord. And so we remember that the next week how God raised up this appalling enemy to come against Israel. As he was doing that, though, he also says, these people, these arrogant people, will not prevail. But in the meantime, the righteous will live, him and us. And that's a directive to us. It's a directive to bravely live in the tension with faith in God. So that kind of begs the question, well, what is the meaning of faith? And so we have 2 meanings that we're taught in this. Recognizing the power of God even in the dark times. He kept driving at that. Remember, he had the people look back and see all the acts of power that God had done on behalf of Israel. And the second thing is having your heart changed by Jesus. That's what happens when times are dark. Having your heart changed by Jesus so you can live above the hard circumstances. So to live by faith is God's plan. That's what we're put here for, to learn to live by faith. It has to happen for this to happen. And we learned this last week. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And so it is Christians that help that happen. Christians who share their faith, who share the knowledge of God that they have, the awareness of the power of God with others all over the world. And that's important, but it's also important that we share right here in our own neighborhoods, in our own cities. And we have to know, what do we gain by believing in God? How does faith help us to cling to God, whether it's good times or bad? How does our faith help us? This truth is important on a personal level. It matters because you're going to come across hard times, but it also is important on a national level. It's important to understand that because Israel was a nation, and they gained a lot from being a nation for the Lord and God's willingness to act on their behalf. They were freed from slavery. They were saved through the waters of the Red Sea. They were given the law of God at Mount Sinai, and the courage to follow and to listen. So we do the very same thing in our faith when we approach life through that faith in God. We often find that tragedy does not have the last word. Something special comes out of tragedy. But we have to fight to keep the faith, to understand what it means to walk with the Lord and to walk by faith. The temptation is to get stuck in tragedy. It's very tempting, but righteousness is gained when we go through with faith. And you cannot have faith and bitterness, which is clinging to the tragedy. You cannot have faith and bitterness at the same time. The righteous live by their faith. That's what the Lord told Habakkuk. And in order to do that, you must humbly release the bad circumstance to God's wisdom. So, Habakkuk reviewed the faith of God towards Israel. I want you to hear that. The faith of God. The faithfulness of God. God's continuing to act toward them in a positive way. And also Israel's faith in God. Israel's faithfulness to God. It works both ways. They were a people who followed God step by step, following their leader, released from Egyptian slavery, getting the law at Sinai, until they finally formed a nation in the land. They conquered the land. They finally formed a nation. Now, think of America. Think of America that was formed in the Reformation. All this explosion in Europe of industry, of education, literacy, art exploded, and people came here from everywhere and settled in this land. Commingling together, they were together, forming a system of government, a government under God, a nation under God. And that's our history. But Israel split after 120 years. It was a governmental struggle. Governmental powers began struggling in Israel, and they had power struggles within as their nation, and they began losing their faith in God. So it's personal, national. And as they lost their faith in God, they looked at the others that were all around them, these pagan nations that had pagan religions, and they began following those pagan religions. And they lost their faith. They lost their faith, and then after that, within 300 years, Israel fell. That was the northern kingdom. The southern kingdom, Judah, that's what Habakkuk saw coming for them as well. And so Habakkuk is so upset, and that precipitated his prayer. He personally had to live by faith through all of this and help others. He had to call others. That was a prophet's job, to call others to live by faith, to help them, strengthen them, that this is hard times, but we're going to stick with the Lord. He knew that by faith and not bitterness, that they would seek either their own solution, survive with God. And we can survive in tragedy and hard times. He wrote this as a conclusion, and this is today's passage. Even though the fig trees have no blossoms and there are no grapes on the vines, even though the olive crop fails and the fields lie empty and barren, Even though the flocks die in the fields and the cattle barns are empty, yet, I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in the God of my salvation. The sovereign Lord is my strength, he says. He makes me as sure-footed as a deer, able to tread upon the heights. So, ease and no troubles in life, that's not the goal. It seems to be the goal, don't we all? I mean, we would all like that to be the goal. Unfortunately, success in life is not that at all. It is actually relying on God's presence every moment, God's power, holding on to God's ways close to you through faith. That's what makes you strong and resilient. That's what, to the end, you can just be full of vibrancy if you do that. If you do that. Living with God is to become courageous by faith. We do this together as a church. We can't do this going it alone. We have to have each other. We build each other up. We hold each other, lift each other up. Israel would fall, but would God's plan fail? No. That's the power of faith. 600 years later, Jesus would quietly and humbly be born. You heard how humble the whole process was. He gave up his divine privileges. He came as a slave, took the position, low position. He was born as a human. He practiced all his earthly life obedience to God. He died on a cross. That's humbling. Jesus had to live by faith all the way to the cross. Do you ever think of that? Do you ever think it was easy for Jesus? He had to live by faith every day. It looks like failure. It didn't look productive. Jesus didn't look like he was in charge. But he had to live by faith in order to teach us to live by faith. Where are we going to learn? We have to learn from the source. And so he's often defined as weak. You've heard meek and mild, Jesus. He's often defined in those terms, not thought of as the strongest man on earth. I assure you, he was not weak, meek, or mild. He had completely mastered lifestyle of faith, and that's what every time, that's what he taught. Habakkuk described it like this: even when nothing looks promising and life looks barren and dead, I have joy, salvation, sure-footedness, and strength. He became courageous through faith. Do you want to be courageous and sure-footed? I mean, the option is weak and bitter and battered around and fearful. While the humility of Jesus may be seen as uninformed and unintelligent, Jesus took another route, and he rose to the highest place of honor before God. The whole world has been changed by the salvation that he offered, and by his actions, and by his disciples who went out then and spread the message. People like you and me, we're still to be doing that. Becoming courageous through faith. That's our opportunity. When times are dark, if you do that, you will be elevated too. You will be blessed too. You will become as sure-footed as a deer. And we don't think, we probably are a little annoyed at deers, like around my mother's house when they run across the road when she was living in Georgetown. They were everywhere. But think of the ram up on the mountain, able to tread upon the heights. And that's what God said to Habakkuk. Well, when he was saying that, he was saying, you're going to walk on those heights that right now the enemy is walking on. The enemy possesses that territory. You are going to have that territory. Now let's think of it like this. This week we celebrate, or remember, not celebrate, but remember 9/11 when our country was attacked and our buildings were knocked down. There they were, one moment, and there they were the next. Someone had a claim on those buildings. In fact, 6 weeks prior to that day, a man named Larry Silverstein had signed a 99-year lease on the whole complex of the World Trade Center. He said 9/11/2001 was the worst day of his life. But then he recalls the actions of people. He says thousands of New Yorkers decided to come down to the site. They simply volunteered to put themselves in terrible danger, taking a lot of courage, and endeavor to rescue people. He said it was New York at its finest. He said, I was so proud to know that these people were coming down to help the best they could. And Mr. Silverstein immediately decided to rebuild after the 9/11 attacks. It wasn't easy. It took courage and faith. He had to fight legal battles with 7 insurance companies. He had to develop a plan that would work for everybody. In 2 weeks after this attack, they had their first design meeting to begin to rebuild. Now the disaster zone became a business center with 3 skyscrapers, a transportation hub, a museum, and a memorial. On 9/11/2001, Mr. Silverstein was 70 years old. Of course, today he's 90. The project is not done. He says this, since I'm only 90, no rush, I have plenty of time. That is courage. Do you want to be there as a believer? You have that opportunity. I want to be there, and I pray that you do too. Amen. Now, before I go to the table, I want to tell you one more little thing about Mr. Silverstein. On that day, that morning, he had a meeting in the towers in one of the offices there. And so he was getting dressed to go downtown to meet with his tenant. And his wife stopped him before he went out the door and said, you can't go. And he said, why not? And she said, well, you have an appointment with the dermatologist that I made, and last month you canceled it. You're not canceling it a second time. So he didn't go, and it saved his life, and he was able. And he said this, when you're married for 45 years to the same woman and she gets upset, you can't let that happen. So that's his miracle.